Chris Shinnick, C1 Review covering Las Vegas and the world if you haven't already. Please hit that like button below and please hit that subscribe button below to keep up with everything we have going on here at C1 Review in Las Vegas and beyond. We greatly appreciate today's singer and songwriter, Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, died. He was 82 years old. Of course, when you think of the Beach Boys, you think of some of the songs like California Girls and Surfin' USA, among others. And wouldn't it be nice if we took a trip down memory lane? And what do I mean by that? Of course, in 2016, we spoke with Toni Tennille, of course, of the famous Captain and Tennille, of course. Love Will Keep Us Together, one of their famous songs, and The Way I Want to Touch You. We're going to look back at our 2016 C1 review of Toni Tennille, where she talked about Brian Wilson, the Beach Boys, and being the only beach girl. Yes, there was a beach girl besides the famous Beach Boys. Here is that CY interview with Toni Tennille.
You're on CY Interview.
I'm Chris Yandek. Featured columnist Jay Bilstein is with me. Earlier this year, we had a great chance to speak with one of the great vocalists in music, and we welcome back Grammy winner Toni Tennille. Her book, Toni Tennille, A Memoir, is out, of course, and the audiobook is being nominated in consideration for a Grammy. Miss Tennille, thanks so much for being with us back today on CY Interview. How are you?
I'm great, Chris. Thank you so much. And Jay, it's nice to talk to you, too.
Good morning. Good to be here with you.
Toni, what is it like, take me through the process of what doing the audio book was like. We really didn't talk about that in the first interview.
The audio book was a wonderful experience for me. I'll have to say, Audible, it was great working with them. They sent down here to Florida a really terrific young producer and a great engineer here in town. And it was my first experience, narrating a book. I've done some voiceovers and things of that nature, but I found it to be very, very emotional for me as I went through it, because it's one thing to write the book and to read it, and then basically I just did it. We just started at chapter 1 and went straight through. There was not a bunch of stopping and starting, only if there was some little technical thing going on that we had to redo. But what I found was reading my own words, and also as beautifully enhanced by my niece, Caroline. She was the icing on my cake, my plain cake. She put the icing on it with her words. I relived everything. And I remember as I was narrating it, reading it, I would feel emotions coming up, natural emotions, some joyful, some sad, and I was thinking to myself, okay, you should probably be professional and control, your feelings as you're doing this. But I thought, no, this is my story, and I'm going to let it, fall as it may. If I were reading or narrating for another author, then I would be acting. It would be a matter of, creating a character or characters and so forth. But this was me, and it was my story. And I found it very, very, very moving to do. And when I finally listened back to it after it was finished, I was pretty pleased with how it turned out.
And what is it like now to have this be considered for a Grammy?
Well, when Audible notified me that they had submitted it for consideration for the spoken word category, first of all, I couldn't believe it. And then I thought, well, in my wildest dreams, to at this stage in my career, which is, face it, it's towards the end, to go have a Grammy for Record of the Year to begin my career, and then to have a spoken word Grammy towards the end here would just be, I don't know, a perfect a perfect ending. It would be pretty wonderful. However, I have to say that a gentleman who interviewed me some time ago, who's kind of in the know, said, well, Toni, said, I'll have to tell you that the books that usually win spoken word are ones by politicians or political books. So I thought, well, that's not my book, so we'll see what happens.
Jay?
Well, when you say political books, you immediately made me think that I didn't think this season we'd have any political books that would be up for any kind of contention for anything, except get us away from this political season. But maybe somebody will write that book next year. But let me take a turn here,
okay,
and say, first of all, your book was absolutely tremendous. For me, having grown up through the 70s, it was particularly meaningful.
Yeah.
Because to a great extent, your music was, the soundtrack of my growing up period.
Yeah.
So, it's interesting. I think an artist can create a song, they can create a painting or what have you, but there's also a dynamic interaction with the audience or with the fan and so forth, and with each interaction, there's a kind of different story to be revealed. And certainly I found myself going through my own trip down memory lane and reading your book, and I'm sure many of your fans and people who know your music over the years probably felt the same way. I thought when you said about being toward the end of your career, I thought for a moment of another Toni Bennett.
Yeah. Oh,
And
yes.
he's out there at 90, and I'm listening to you, and of course I listened to the first interview you had with Chris, and I'm listening to you now, and the quality of your voice, to me, sounds as good, if not better, than it ever has. Is there any possibility, at all that you would say, gee whiz, Toni Bennett's been out there 90 years old, maybe there is still something for me to do, I've still got my voice, I suspect you still love music. Would you consider continuing along in some way?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's already in the works. I mean, I do know I have a voice that has value still and still sounds good. And I've been toying with the idea, not really toying, I'm actually thinking about it, doing some voice work for other authors. I love that. I love the fact, and I would like to do one for an author where it's not me, that I'm talking about, so I could create a character with my voice, and have the book that the author wrote come across the way the author wanted it. It's kind of like singing. When I sing the songs of the great songwriters of the 30s and 40s, when lyrics were really very special and well crafted. My job as a singer, I always thought, was to put across to the audience exactly what the songwriters were trying to accomplish with the song, the mood, the emotion, and that's what I would love to do for other authors. And the other thing I love about it is that I just, don't have to dress up. I can go in the studio in, sweatpants and no makeup, and I don't have to worry about the red carpet or anything like that. I just go in there and do the job, and I love that.
Would you consider getting into the studio and singing?
It's possible. I'm thinking about that, and when I first moved here, I just moved to Florida a little over a year ago, and I have to admit it was a huge move because I lived in the West for about 50 years, and now back in the South. I was born and raised in Alabama, and near my sister Jane. I'm just a mile and a half from her. But it was a huge change, and I didn't realize how kind of stunned I would be for the first 6 months, surrounded by boxes that hadn't been opened yet, and just kind of overwhelmed by what I had done. So everything kind of came to a screeching halt as far as creativity and where I'm going to go. And my thought was, let me just live my life and deal with it a day at a time and see where I'm going to go. One of the exciting things I just found out about 2 weeks ago was one of the really fine musicians that I and Daryl and I worked with for years has moved to Orlando. His name is Matt Kattengub, and he actually co-produced one of my big band albums, the one called Things Are Swinging. He's a great musician, fine pianist, sax player, arranger, conducts all over the world. He's in Orlando now, and I have somebody I know who I know is a great musician, who knows my music, Captain and Tennille music, and also that music of the 30s and 40s that I sang with symphonies and big bands for years. So I've got somebody I really know and trust that's nearby, and who knows what we might do.
Has anybody ever spoken to you about taking the Captain and Tennille songbook and attempting to create something like a Broadway show? I'm thinking of what went on, for example, with ABBA, and look, ended up with a movie. Meryl Streep was in it. Has there ever been any talk about that? Take that and create some kind of story.
Well, this just in. No, I've known about this for a while. Not a Broadway show yet, but there is some interest in a film. And I'm very cautious about that, because I want Daryl, I especially want our story. You know, I have to remember, we were not kids when we met. I was 31 when I met Daryl. He was 29. When we had our first hit, I was 35 when Love Will Keep Us Together hit #1. So whoever would play either of us, I would hope would be more mature, you know, somebody who'd lived a little bit and not some really young person who hadn't had a life yet. So I was also concerned with the way Daryl was portrayed. I wanted to make sure that he didn't come off as, you know, as some kind of a goofy guy. I mean, he is a goofy guy in a way, but he's a genius. And I wanted to make sure that his fine musicianship and so forth came on. We weren't able to make it as a couple, a romantic couple, because he just wasn't there. He wasn't that, which it took me a long time to find out. But musically, I was the most creative I've ever been when I was with him. He spurred me on to write and you know, and so forth, and so I'm so grateful for that. And I still talk to him once every week or so. We talk on the phone, and I just saw him this month when I was back in Prescott just to see how he was doing. And also, my sisters and I sang for a gay couple, friends of ours that had been together for 32 years and finally were able to marry in Arizona. So we sang for their wedding, which was a great thing. So, you know, we still talk. We still have a business together. Daryl and I still own our publishing company together, and he's always had a good business mind, and I defer to him in many cases for that. But, you know, emotionally, it didn't happen for us.
How has he reacted to your book?
You know, I think he's reacted. I think he's been very happy and kind of excited in his own Daryl way that people are interested again in the music and going over it again and remembering it. And some people who had never heard it before. For example, one of my friends just brought to my attention a really fascinating review by a gal who had never read, had no clue who I was, had never heard of Captain and Tennille. She just liked reading memoirs and biographies and just happened to order the book. Well, she wrote this wonderful review, and she said that once she started listening to the songs that were mentioned in the book, she faintly remembered them from her childhood. But what really I loved about her review is that she didn't come from it as a partisan of our music, pro or con. She just wanted to read the story. And she loved it. The story about my childhood growing up in Alabama and all that, which I thought, I don't know if only people that liked our music would be interested in this. No, and that was amazing to me, and that was very heartwarming to me. And I think when people, they don't write to Daryl. He never writes back to anybody. I mean, you can write to him on his email address, but he doesn't write back. But when I call him and I say, Daryl, listen to what this person said. Listen to what they said about the music. I know it pleases him that it's resurfaced again, so to speak.
You know what I find so interesting as you speak, going through the 70s, I had, been a fan of the Beach Boys, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, etc.
Yeah, me too.
it's interesting because somehow your music, which was seemingly always on the radio, right? And when I was in the car with my folks, AM radio, no FM, so they would have on, for example, in New York City, WABC, which was a pop station, and we'd be driving to the beach or what have you, and I would inevitably have a crush on some girl in high school, and there would a Captain and Tennille song pop on, and so my personal experiences got tied to individual Captain and Tennille songs. It's funny. I guess it was 1976 when Lonely Nights, Angel Face came out.
Yes,
which
that's
was,
right.
I want to think, was that your third hit?
Let's see. We had Love Will Keep Us Together, The Way I Want to Touch You in the first album. Gosh, I think it was in the second album, and I'm pretty sure it was our third or fourth because we had
that was in '76, and it was a Neil Sedaka song, and interesting. Neil Sedaka lived probably a mile from me.
Oh, you're kidding.
No, not at all. He lived right off a highway in New York City, kind of tucked away, and not that many people knew. What are your memories of that song? That, for some reason, seems to be a song. When I know of people who are Captain and Tennille fans, and I speak with them, they'll remember certain songs, but Lonely Nights, Angel Face is not one of them that right away crops up. And I think it was an excellent song. What is it? What are some of your memories of that song?
Okay, well, what I think of is when we loved the song when we heard, basically the demo that Neil and Howie Greenfield, who wrote the lyrics, had done. And I thought it was a lot of fun. I just thought it was fun. So, of course, turned it over to Daryl, who was the producer, and when he started coming up with the jungle sounds and all those weird stuff, all those weird things, I thought, okay, well, we'll just go with the flow because he's usually right. And it was a quirky, odd production, but of course it was one of our big hits. And I remember we were doing television at the time, and that was actually before we had our own television show. We were guest appearing on other people's shows. And we did have our TV show, and the choreographers had a lot of fun creating some kind of a video-ish sort of thing for that song because it was so quirky. Daryl had a kind of a weird, quirky sense of humor in his music. And honestly, I never knew where he was going with it, and it was like Happy Together, our version of Happy Together, which was kind of a disco version that we did when we signed with Casablanca. And it ended up being a trip through the Middle East somehow, thanks to Daryl. And I just had to kind of laugh, when we did it, but it was fun, and it was silly, and it was fun.
I mentioned the political season we're in when we began, and I know in your book you spoke about an experience with President and Mrs. Ford, and I remember that the former First Lady actually had a request for a particular song for you to sing. I don't want to give it away because there are plenty of people who may not have read the book who will be listening to this, and I'd love for them to get the book because it's that good. Looking where things were back then, being in the White House and all, and looking at what has happened today in our presidential elections, and how just something has taken a turn into perhaps the worst vitriol we've ever seen, probably, at least in my lifetime, I'm certain. What reflections do you have about that within the context of where we are now politically?
Well, I remember my experience at the White House is just a lovely experience. President and Mrs. Ford were just genial and delightful hosts. She requested a song that had been a hit for us that we were not considering performing because I thought it would be a little bit risque, maybe, for the White House. Now, let me say, as a songwriter and a lyricist, I write my own music and my lyrics. And a lot of times my lyrics have subtext that some people get and some people don't. It can be taken on a more superficial level, or you can dig in and find some other things in it. Intentional, most of the time. And I thought this song, which I had actually written in a more... I need to say the name of the song.
Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, it was The Way I Want to Touch You, which was one of the very first songs I ever wrote for Daryl. And I meant, when I wrote it, I meant the way I wanted to touch him emotionally. I wanted to, delve into his psyche and figure out what he was all about. But it could be taken physically as well, and I'm sure part of me meant that too. And so if you go through the lyrics, you can find just about anything you want, just like in Do That to Me One More Time, which is another one of my songs that people can find, what they want in there, what I wrote or what they want. But I thought that The Way I Want to Touch You would be a little too risque, maybe, for the White House, though we had decided not to do it. But Mrs. Ford came in during sound check and rehearsal, and and we had a little chat, and she said, "Well, what are you going to play?" And I named a couple of songs. She said, "Well, you're going to do The Way I Want to Touch You, aren't you?" And I said, "Well," and she said, "Oh, you must. That's mine and Jerry's favorite song." And I thought, well, okay. So we did do it. We did perform it. And it's interesting about The Way I Want to Touch You. At that time, I remember there was a big station in St. Louis that refused to play it because they thought it was too risque. And I went, wait a minute. And, of course, now anything goes. So I kind of always wanted to, for example, in movies, I kind of liked it when they left it to my imagination what went on after the big kiss instead of showing me, because I had my own thoughts. And I don't know, I kind of like to lead people to wherever they would like to go with my music.
You know what? I think that all of us are probably somewhat better off when something is left to our imagination, but in an age of Instagram and Twitter and all kinds of other things, it seems to have taken something away from that. But let's turn to something a little positive.
Okay, I love that.
It's interesting. That, to me, I know people who are your fans, and I know Beach Boys fans. I certainly am a Beach Boys fan, but they don't know of your connection to the Beach Boys, which, of course, you get into in your book. Have you, today, if you could touch on that, number one, and number two, have you been, in the last number of years, in contact at all with any of the remaining Beach Boys, Brian Wilson, Mike Love, Al Jardine, David Marks, Bruce Johnson? Is there any contact at all? Because they're still out there.
They are still out there, and it's interesting that you should mention that, because we have tickets, 8th row center orchestra tickets, to see Brian Wilson and the Pet Sounds Tour in March when he's here in Orlando. And I am thrilled to go see that. I never met Brian because Brian was no longer touring when I went out with the Beach Boys. And for your listeners who don't know the story, when I met Daryl, and actually I hired him to play keyboards for a musical I had written called Mother Earth. And when I met Daryl, he had been a backup musician for the Beach Boys for about 6 years. And Daryl got me the gig performing with the Beach Boys because I'm trying to figure out this story because it's kind of complicated. He came up to audition for me, and I hired him to perform with Mother Earth. When Mother Earth closed, Daryl got me a gig performing with the Beach Boys because their regular keyboard player, acoustic keyboard player, took a year off to get his degree. So I became a beach girl and played keyboards for them because Carl Wilson, who had never heard me play, took Daryl's word for it that I could do the job. And the first time they ever heard me play was in Binghamton, New York, at Soundcheck before my very first concert with them. So I was the first and only actually beach girl, I guess. And I'm hoping I do know Al Jardine. I haven't talked to him in a long, long time. But I'm hoping to get backstage to meet Brian. I'm just like, some, little groupie kid that would love to meet him, but I would love to meet him because his writing was very much an influence on my own. In fact, I would say that Love, The Way I Want to Touch You, came out of a writing technique, composing technique that Brian had that I kind of picked up on.
It's interesting you say that. I want to say I probably think Good Vibrations may be one of the greatest songs that was ever composed.
Oh,
in the
Jay,
history
I
of rock and roll.
remember exactly where I was when I heard it. I was living in Southern California, and we were in the back bay. I was by myself, driving along in the back bay with the radio on, and all of a sudden I heard the first notes of Good Vibrations. And I remember I just pulled the car over. I couldn't keep driving. I had to pull the car over and listen to it. It absolutely blew my mind. And I knew it was genius, what I was hearing. And then, of course, later on I went on to love, of course, Pat Sounds. And then I remember one of my favorite songs. It's not one of their big hits. It's called Surf's Up, which I found so touching and so moving, and I think it's one of the last ones that Brian wrote. I'm not sure. He's writing again now, of course, but I mean during that period. So I've been a fan of theirs for years and years and years.
Just out of curiosity, because I don't think I've ever heard anybody ask you this, and it's not mentioned in the books, having worked with the Beach Boys, having been a fan of the Beach Boys, were you also a fan of Jan and Dean, or not really?
Oh yeah. And of course, I was very familiar with their hits. I liked them. I liked the so-called surf music. But I found in Brian a kind of a depth. I mean, of course, they did the Surf in USA and things like that. But as it went on, and as he began to write more, I felt so much more emerging from him as a writer. I felt I was beginning to get a sense of his soul, I guess, coming through in his writing. And that was what really, and the complexity of his chord structures, instead of the simple, 3/4 chord type of pop hits that I loved when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s. I found an almost classical depth in what he was writing, and that's what attracted me.
One of the great virtuosos in the history of rock and roll. Working off of that, Toni, today, we're in such a different time for performers, just so completely different. Sometimes I wonder how folks breaking in can even make money the way everything's set up. iTunes and all that, people don't really buy albums anymore. They buy individual songs and all. What advice would you have for musicians and singers working to break into the business today?
Well, boy, you're asking me. I would say that they need to become very, very adept at social media. And if they are not, they need to find themselves or hire someone to help guide them how to present their work on social media. I don't know a thing about it. Listen, if it wasn't for my co-author, my niece Caroline, and her significant other Michael, who really do know social media, I wouldn't be able to do a darn thing. I can do Facebook, I can do Twitter. The rest of it's just beyond me. And I don't apologize for that. That's another world. And I think music, I kind of like the music that it takes you some time to delve into and understand. And I know that in the times when I was writing and I was composing, there was Carole King before me, there was Carly Simon, there was, Elton John and Billy Joel all around that time. We wrote from our hearts, I guess you could say. And today, a lot of the music is put together almost by committee. it's like you get a beat from this person, and this person specializes in something else, and this person specializes, and you all sort of come together and create a wonderful pop hit. But think of how few really big stars there are. Now, I understand Katy Perry writes some of her own music. Adele, I'm not sure if she writes her own music, but she's a great interpreter of whatever song comes her way. But there are a lot of hits that are just fun, but they're put together by committee. They didn't come from a person or two writers working together, one doing lyrics, one doing music, or them doing it together, that creates this message from their heart or soul, whatever you want to call it. And that's what to me is different.
It brings me to my last question.
Okay.
And by the way, it's just I feel I could speak to you for hours and hours, have so many interesting insights and so many just wonderful things to say. And you know what's so interesting, Toni?
What?
Growing up, listening to your music, I always had the sense of you and the Captain Daryl Dragon as being very nice people. And sometimes nice is not celebrated in our society. When I read your book, I again had the sense of a very nice human being. And again, speaking with you now, I really have a true sense of a very nice, good, kind human being. And I just feel so much of that is lost today, when everything is about getting looks and clicks and listens and everything else, and sometimes it seems like the lowest common denominator attracts attention. That being said, how's your book doing?
It's doing really well. It's just shocking to me that it was out in April. That's quite a long time ago. And it's still selling very, very well, and more people are discovering it, which is what's interesting to me. You have your first 5-6 months, and then you expect it to fall off. Well, it's not selling like it did when I was promoting it like crazy, but it's still selling very, very well and very steadily. So I'm really pleased with how well it's done, and I'm kind of hoping it'll be around for a while, that other people that are interested in that particular era, actually stretching from when I was born in the 40s and in the segregated South up through now, might find it interesting, musically and otherwise.
I'm sure they will. Chris?
So for Grammy winner, and maybe another Grammy winner with Best Spoken Word, Toni Tennille, and featured columnist Jay Bildstein, and CY Interview, I'm Chris Yandek.